Hi, I am Sophia. Welcome to True Payback, where story hits different. Hit subscribe. Let's dive in.
The morning of my wedding, I did what I had done every morning for the past 9 years. I sat on the edge of the bed for 4 minutes before standing. Not because I was nervous, though I was. Not because I was savoring the moment, though I tried to. But because my nervous system needed those 4 minutes to remember what it was supposed to do when I asked my legs to carry me. Marcus had already gone to the hotel suite down the hall with his groomsmen, per tradition. He had kissed me on the forehead at 6 in the morning, held my face in both his hands and said, "Today is yours. All of it." He knew what that meant. He had watched me fight for mornings for 3 years. My maid of honor, Claire, had brought chamomile tea and set it on the nightstand without being asked. She had been doing things like that since we were 22, anticipating the small requirements of my life before I had to name them. I pulled on my robe, reached for the cane leaning against the headboard and stood. It was a good morning. That was the thing nobody outside my immediate medical team truly understood. There were good mornings and there were other mornings, and you never fully knew which one you were getting until your feet found the floor. This one was manageable. The nerve pain was a 4, not a 7. My balance was present. I walked to the window and looked out at the October light spreading gold across the hotel garden where, in 6 hours, I would marry the man who had never once asked me to be more than I was. I should have felt only joy. I did feel joy. But there was something else, too. A low, familiar dread that had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with the guest list. My mother and father were seated at table 4. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at 23, during my second year of graduate school in urban planning. The diagnosis came after 8 months of mysterious symptoms. Numbness that climbed my left side like a tide, a period of double vision that my first doctor attributed to stress, a fall on the stairs of my apartment building that I told no one about because I didn't yet have language for what was happening to my body. Dr. Reeves gave me the diagnosis in a room with a window that overlooked a parking garage. I remember the parking garage more than anything else about that afternoon. The particular gray of it, a minivan pulling out of a spot on the second level. I remember thinking, someone is going somewhere completely ordinary right now and everything is fine for them and it will never be completely fine for me again in the way it was this morning. That is not a tragedy. I want to be precise about that. MS is not a death sentence. Dr. Reeves was careful and thorough and honest. He laid out what we knew, what we didn't know, what the treatment options were, what quality of life looked like for patients across the spectrum. He answered every question I had, and when I ran out of questions and just sat there, he didn't rush me. He had a quality I would come to think of as medical patience. The ability to hold space for someone while they reconfigured who they were. What came after the diagnosis, though, that part was harder in ways I hadn't anticipated. I called my parents from the parking garage. My mother answered on the second ring. I told her what Dr. Reeves had said. I used the words he had used. Relapsing, remitting, lesions, disease-modifying therapy. I was precise because precision felt like the only solid thing available to me. There was a pause. Then my mother said, "Are you sure? Did you get a second opinion?" I said I would. "Because you've always been dramatic about your health, Elena. Remember when you convinced yourself you had mono sophomore year?" I had mono sophomore year. The campus clinic had confirmed it with a blood test. I did not say this. I said I would call her after I'd had time to process. I got a second opinion. And a third. All 3 neurologists reviewed the MRI images and arrived at the same conclusion. The lesions were there. They were not ambiguous. The diagnosis was correct. My mother's response upon hearing this was to recommend a naturopath she had read about in a magazine. The years between my diagnosis and my wedding were 9 years of management, medication schedules, infusion appointments, physical therapy, the careful negotiation between what my body could do on a given day and what I needed it to do. I completed my master's degree. I built a career as a senior urban planner for the city, work I loved because it was fundamentally about designing spaces that worked for everyone, including people like me, people whose physical requirements didn't fit the assumptions built into most of the world. I was good at my job. I had won a regional design award at 28 for a mixed-use transit corridor that had become something of a model for accessible public space. My colleague Daniel liked to say I designed cities the way I lived, with relentless pragmatism and secret idealism. My parents had attended the award ceremony. My mother had worn a red dress and told my colleagues I had always been sensitive. My father had shaken hands with my department director and said he was proud of me, which was the most uncomplicated thing he said to me in the entire decade. The trouble always was the cane. I had begun using it intermittently at 26, during a relapse that left residual balance issues my physical therapist and I had worked hard to manage. Some days I didn't need it. Some days I did. The variance was the nature of relapsing remitting MS. It was not a linear condition. It moved in waves. You learned to read the water. My mother read the cane as theater. "You didn't have it at Daniel's birthday last month," she said once at a family dinner, gesturing at it as though it were a prop I had selected from a rack. "I didn't need it at Daniel's birthday," I said. "I need it today." "It just seems convenient," she said, "that you need it when there's family around." My father didn't agree with her out loud. He just didn't disagree, which over 9 years, I had come to understand as its own position. My brother, Kevin, was somewhere in the middle. Not cruel, not supportive, just absent in the particular way of people who have decided that a difficult family dynamic is simply weather and the best approach is a good umbrella. He had moved to Portland 5 years ago and called on holidays. At Christmas 2 years before my wedding, he had told me privately that he thought Mom went too far sometimes, and then immediately changed the subject to his new truck. The one constant in my family was that my condition was treated as a choice I was making. A performance of suffering that, if I simply decided to stop performing it, would disappear. I had stopped trying to convince them by 28. Dr. Reeves had gently suggested, after I had described several of these interactions, that the energy I was spending trying to change their minds was energy my nervous system needed for other things. He was right. I redirected it. I built my life. And my life was genuinely good. I want to say that clearly. Marcus, whom I had met at a city planning conference when we were both 29, had asked me on our second date to tell him what my life actually looked like medically, not to assess whether I was manageable, but because he wanted to understand who I was. I had told him. He had listened in the particular way that means someone is filing information away carefully rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. He had never once made me feel like a burden. He had also never pretended my condition wasn't real, which by that point in my life, felt like an extraordinary gift. Claire had been my person through all of it. The hospitalizations, the medication changes, the 2 major relapses, the year I had to use a wheelchair for 4 months. She had sat with me in infusion waiting rooms reading trashy novels out loud. She had learned, unprompted, the names of all my medications. She had told my mother once at a birthday dinner in a very level voice, that what she was saying was not accurate and she should stop. My mother had not spoken to Claire warmly since. Claire did not appear to care. Dr. Reeves had been my neurologist for 9 of those years. He was 61, quiet, meticulous, and possessed of a dry humor that only appeared in small quantities, like a spice used correctly. He had adjusted my treatment twice, guided me through both major relapses, and attended my award ceremony because I had made the mistake of mentioning it, and he had said with no fanfare whatsoever, "That's worthwhile work." He had a wife named Patricia and twin daughters in college, and he came to my wedding because Marcus and I had, after some deliberation, invited him. He was not just my doctor. He was, in the way that sometimes happens with people who have helped you survive something, part of the architecture of my life. He was seated at table 7 with his wife. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock in the garden. The October light did exactly what I had hoped. Marcus cried, which I had predicted and which delighted me. My vows were specific and true. His were funny and then suddenly not funny, and half the guests were wiping their eyes by the end. Claire stood beside me and held my small bouquet when I needed both hands. The minister, who had known Marcus since childhood, called us a genuine match, which is a simple thing to say and somehow the most correct. I walked the aisle with my cane. I had considered not using it, and I want to be transparent about that consideration because it is important to understanding everything that came after. I had wondered, in the weeks before the wedding, whether the pictures would look different without it, whether guests would feel distracted by it, whether my dress photographs better in motion without the cane's geometry in the frame. I had this thought and I examined it and I recognized it for what it was. 9 years of a family telling me my medical equipment was a choice, seeping into my own decision-making. I called Dr. Reeves, described my most recent symptom pattern, and asked for his honest assessment of my balance stability on what was expected to be a high-stress, long-day event. He said, "Use the cane." I used the cane. I walked down the aisle on my wedding day using the medically appropriate equipment for my documented neurological condition, And I married Marcus in the October light, and I did not fall, and it was one of the best moments of my life. The reception began at 6. My parents arrived to the cocktail hour already in a particular mood that I recognized. My mother's smile was 3 degrees too wide, the kind that meant she was performing pleasantness while managing something underneath it. My father was working the room in his hearty hand-on-the-shoulder way that had always read to strangers as warmth and to me as strategy. Marcus's family was warm and uncomplicated in ways that still surprised me. His mother, Diane, had hugged me at the rehearsal dinner and said, "We're so glad Marcus found someone serious," which I understood to mean serious about living rather than serious about appearances. His sister, Priya, had organized half the logistical details of the reception because she ran an events company and had announced 3 weeks before the wedding that she was simply going to handle certain things and I was to stop managing them myself. I had let her. It was a relief so significant it had startled me. I was at the head table 40 minutes into the reception. The speeches were done. Claire's had made everyone laugh and then cry. Marcus's best friend, David, had done a respectable job of being funny without saying anything that would age badly. The dancing had begun. I was not dancing. I was at the table with Marcus's Aunt Lorraine, who was telling me about a garden she was designing in her backyard with a level of detail that was genuinely interesting, and I was having, in this small pocket of the evening, a lovely time. Marcus was on the floor with his college friends. He caught my eye across the room and smiled. The private smile, the real one, not the public one. I smiled back. I reached for my cane, which was leaning against the chair beside me, preparing to stand and get water from the bar. My mother's hand closed around it first. She didn't take it quietly. That was the thing. If she had leaned over and murmured something, the way a person might if they had even a particle of awareness that what they were about to do was wrong, if there had been any hesitation, any lowering of the voice, what happened next would have been different. But she stood and she lifted the cane away from the chair with a decisive motion, and she turned to face the room. Elena. Her voice was the voice she used when she was performing. The room-carrying voice. "You don't need this." Lorraine stopped talking mid-sentence. The nearest tables quieted in the ripple effect of sudden social tension. "You've been sitting here for 40 minutes just fine," my mother continued. She held the cane out to one side, slightly away from her body, the way you hold something you're planning to set down. "You're not going to need it to walk to the bar. You don't need to carry this everywhere for the effect." My father, seated 3 tables away, turned. He saw what was happening. He did not stand up. He raised his glass in a small, confirming gesture. Not a toast, not a celebration, just an alignment. An endorsement. 2 of my cousins, seated at my mother's table, made the specific expression people make when they are uncomfortable with something but also relieved that someone else is doing it. "Mom," I said. My voice was level. I had had 9 years of practice. "Give it back. When you're ready to stop using it as a prop," she said, "you won't need it back." The room was not silent. The band was still playing, the bar was still active at the far end, but the nearest 40 people had stopped talking. I was aware of Claire, 3 seats down, going very still. I was aware of Priya on the dance floor stopping mid-step. I was aware of Marcus, still on the floor, who had not yet seen what was happening behind him. I stood. I stood without the cane because it was no longer available to me, and I took 1 step toward my mother, and my left leg gave the fractional, involuntary betrayal that my left leg sometimes gave when I was upright without adequate support, and I sat back down. Not a dramatic collapse. A quiet, precise mechanical failure of the kind that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with neurological lesions on a cervical MRI that I had seen with my own eyes and that 3 separate neurologists had reviewed and documented over 9 years. I sat down. My mother smiled. "See," she said. "It's the heels." Claire was already rising. Priya was moving through the room toward us. Marcus had turned and was reading the scene from across the floor, his expression shifting. And from table 7, Dr. Richard Reeves set down his wine glass. I had not planned this. I want to be absolutely clear. I had not invited Dr. Reeves and Patricia to my wedding as a strategy. I had invited them because they were people I cared about. Marcus had agreed without hesitation because he understood who Dr. Reeves was in the story of my life. There was no calculation. There was no setup. What happened next was simply the consequence of my mother's decision to perform at my wedding, in front of 112 people, an act she had been performing privately for 9 years. and doing it in a room that happened to contain the one person on earth most qualified to respond. Dr. Reeves stood. He was not a tall man, perhaps 5'10", trim, gray at the temples, wearing a dark suit that Patricia had probably selected. He straightened his tie. It was a small motion, precise and unhurried, and it drew the eye in the way that genuine composure always draws the eye against the backdrop of someone else's theatrics. He walked from table 7 toward my mother. He took his time. Each step was deliberate. The nearest guests tracked him without fully understanding yet what they were watching. He stopped approximately 4 feet from my mother. He looked at her with the same expression I had seen him use in clinical contexts when he was delivering information that was unambiguous and not subject to negotiation. Absolute. He said, "That belongs to my patient." 7 words. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. The nearest 20 guests heard every one of them. My mother blinked. She had the cane still held to one side. The smile had stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. "The cane," Dr. Reeves said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "It belongs to my patient. I'd like you to return it to her." "I don't know who you are," my mother said, and the performance came back into her voice. The social bristle of someone who has been interrupted by a stranger and has decided the stranger is the problem. "My name is Dr. Richard Reeves," he said. "I am a board-certified neurologist and I have been Elena's treating physician for 9 years. I have reviewed the MRI imaging that documents lesions affecting her balance and coordination. I have managed her treatment through 2 significant relapses. I have signed the medical documentation that authorizes the use of ambulatory assistance devices. That cane is not a prop. It is prescribed mobility equipment for a patient with a documented neurological disease." He paused. "And you just removed it from her on her wedding day." The room in the vicinity of this conversation was now fully quiet. Patricia, at table 7, had her hands folded in her lap and her expression was one I recognized as the expression of someone who has been married to a precise man for a long time and knows that precision, deployed correctly, is its own form of devastation. My mother said, "She's my daughter. I know what she's." "With respect," Dr. Reeves said, and the phrase landed with the peculiar weight it carries when a person of genuine authority uses it to mean its opposite. "What you know about her condition is less than what her most recent MRI tells me in the first 3 images. The stability she has maintained, her ability to be standing at her own wedding today, to have walked that aisle, represents 9 years of careful medical management, disciplined adherence to treatment, and a level of personal resilience that I have not seen exceeded in my clinical career. What you are describing as a performance is the visible edge of a disease she manages every single day." He took 1 step forward. "Now, I am going to ask you one more time to return that cane to my patient." My mother looked at the cane in her hand. She looked at Dr. Reeves. She looked at the room, at Marcus's mother who was watching with an expression of controlled fury, at Priya who had her phone in her hand and had, I would later learn, been recording since the moment my mother took the cane, at Marcus who had reached the edge of the scene and was standing very still in the way he stood very still when he was containing something enormous, at Claire, who was beside me with her hand on my shoulder. She set the cane on the table. She did not set it back where it belonged next to my chair. She set it on the nearest table surface with a controlled motion and then straightened and looked at the room with the remnants of her composure arranged across her face. "I was only trying to help," she said. It was the wrong thing to say and I believe she knew it was the wrong thing to say even as she said it, but there was nothing else left in the register of things that sounded reasonable so she said it anyway. Dr. Reeves turned from her, picked up the cane from the table and brought it to me. He set it in my hand. He looked at me with the expression he used when something clinical had gone correctly. "You look well," he said quietly. "Congratulations on your marriage." Then he returned to table 7. The band, which had paused in the indefinable way that bands do when the room's energy shifts, resumed. The bar traffic restarted. People returned to their conversations with the slightly elevated animation of guests who have just witnessed something remarkable and are processing it through the medium of talking about other things. Marcus was beside me within 30 seconds. He crouched next to my chair and took both my hands. He didn't say anything about my mother. He said, "Are you okay? Did the fall hurt anything?" "It wasn't a fall," I said. "It was a sit." He laughed. The laugh was tight, he was angry, and the laugh was the way he was keeping the anger from going somewhere he didn't want it to go tonight. He kissed my hands and said, "Okay. We can talk about the rest of it later. Right now, do you want water or do you want to murder someone?" "Water first," I said. He got me water. What happened in the following hour was not a confrontation. Not the kind with raised voices and ultimatums. What happened was more surgical than that. Priya came to our table with her phone and showed Marcus and me the video. It was 47 seconds. It began just after my mother took the cane and ended with Dr. Reeves returning it to me. The audio was clear. My mother's words were clear. Dr. Reeves's words were clear. The room's silence during his 7-word opening was audible in the video as its own kind of statement. Priya said, "This is yours. You decide what happens with it." Marcus's mother, Diane, went to my parents' table. I watched from across the room. The conversation lasted approximately 6 minutes. My mother's wide smile did not return during those 6 minutes. My father's hand on the shoulder energy did not return. By the end of the 6 minutes, both of my parents had the expression of people who have been told something plainly and have run out of frameworks for denying it. Diane came back to me afterward. She sat beside me and she said, "I want you to know that what happened tonight will not be forgotten in our family. Not because we're angry, though we are. But because you deserved better for a very long time, and I want you to know that we see that." I thanked her. It was the second time I had cried that day, the first having been during Marcus's vows, which was appropriate. This second time was less composed. Claire handed me a tissue from somewhere I couldn't identify, which was so precisely Claire that I laughed through the tears. My parents left the reception 35 minutes early. They said their goodbyes to Marcus, not to me. Kevin, my brother, who had witnessed the entire scene from his table, found me before they left and said, "I'm sorry. I should have done more." For years. It was more than he had ever said and less than what 9 years warranted, and I received it with the kind of complicated gratitude that doesn't fully resolve. The next 2 weeks were not clean. I want to resist the narrative instinct to make what came after simple because it wasn't. My mother called 3 days after the wedding. She did not apologize. She said she had been worried about me, and that the scene at the wedding had been taken out of context. I told her clearly and without anger that Dr. Reeves had offered to provide a written statement to any family member who wanted to understand the clinical reality of my condition. I told her the video existed and that I had it. I told her that whether she accepted the reality of my diagnosis was her choice, but that her choices about how she treated me in public, and in private, were going to have consequences that she should consider carefully. She said she would think about it. I don't know what that meant. I accepted it as the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. Dr. Reeves, in our next appointment 2 weeks after the wedding, wrote a formal medical summary at my request. A 2-page clinical document detailing my diagnosis, treatment history, functional limitations, and the appropriate use of ambulatory equipment. He gave me 4 copies. He said, without drama, "For whatever use you determine appropriate." My father called the week after my mother. He asked me, not demanded, asked, if he could read the summary. I sent it to him. He was quiet on the phone for a moment and then said, "I didn't know it was that serious." I said, "I know." There was a long pause. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions earlier. It was not everything. It was not the beginning of a transformed relationship. But it was a stone turned over, and underneath it was something that had never been there before." Kevin called Patricia, Dr. Reeves's wife, separately, to apologize for our family's behavior at the reception. Patricia told me about this at a clinic follow-up, with the dry warmth of someone who has seen a great many families navigate these moments. I hadn't asked Kevin to do that. He had done it on his own. The thing I have come to understand in the years since is that the wedding was not the story of my triumph over my family. It was the story of a truth that had been in the room for 9 years finally becoming audible to everyone at the same time. Dr. Reeves didn't say anything I hadn't said. He used the same words I had used. Lesions, documented, prescribed. But he said them from a position of clinical authority in a room full of witnesses on the day I was supposed to be celebrated. And the combination of context and credential and moment meant that what had bounced off my family for 9 years finally landed. What I lost, though, this is the part that doesn't resolve cleanly, was the version of this day I had imagined before I understood who my parents were. I had known, walking toward the garden at 4 o'clock, that the day was going to be complicated. But I had not fully let go of some subterranean hope that my mother would see me in my dress in the October light and be moved by something other than the need to manage how things appeared. That hope did not survive the evening. What replaced it was something more durable and more honest, but it was not hope of the same kind, and I have had to make peace with that. Marcus and I honeymooned in Portugal. I packed my medication and my cane and 2 very good novels and a 3rd novel I never opened because Portugal in October is genuinely too beautiful to read indoors. I walked more than I expected and less than I would have liked, and exactly as much as my body permitted, and it was enough. Dr. Reeves sent a card that arrived when we returned. It was a plain card, cream, no design, and inside he had written, "Well managed. As always." That was it. 4 words. I put it on the shelf above my desk between my design award and the photograph of Claire and me at my thesis defense, and I see it every morning when I sit on the edge of the bed and wait for my body to remember what it knows. Some mornings it takes 4 minutes. Some mornings it takes 6. Either way I stand.